A certain song hits its chorus, and without warning, a wave of small bumps rises across your arms, or someone tells a story that gives you chills down your spine, or you simply step outside on a cold morning and watch the hair on your arm stand up on its own, with no instruction from you whatsoever. Here's what should genuinely puzzle you about this. You have almost no body hair. Compared to nearly every other mammal on the planet, you are functionally naked. And yet, your body still runs a reflex whose entire original purpose was to make hair stand up. A reflex that fires perfectly on schedule, decades after the thing it evolved to control largely disappeared. That's not a small oversight. That's your body faithfully executing instructions for equipment it no longer has. Let's start with what's actually happening physically, because the mechanism itself is elegant, even if the payoff for a mostly hairless species seems pointless. Each hair follicle on your body is attached to a tiny muscle called the erector pili. When you're cold, frightened, or experiencing certain intense emotions, your sympathetic nervous system, the same system responsible for your fight or flight response, fires a signal to these muscles. They contract. Each hair follicle gets pulled slightly upright, and the skin around it puckers into the small raised bump you know as a goosebump. It's called piloerection, and it's an old, deeply automatic reflex, not something you can consciously trigger or stop. Charles Darwin, characteristically, was already thinking about this in the 19th century. He noted that piloerection appears across a wide range of mammals and proposed it served two connected evolutionary functions, both of which depend entirely on having a substantial coat of fur to work with. The first function is thermoregulation. When a furred animal gets cold, raising each individual hair increases the amount of air trapped between the strands. Trapped air is an excellent insulator, so a coat of raised fur creates a thicker layer of warm, still air next to the skin, functioning essentially like the animal is fluffing up its own built-in blanket. Watch a cat or a dog in cold weather, and you can often see this happening directly, their fur visibly thickening and standing slightly on end. The second function is about looking bigger. When many mammals feel threatened or are trying to intimidate a rival, the same reflex fires. But this time, the goal isn't warmth, it's size. A frightened or aggressive cat with its fur standing fully on end looks noticeably larger and more formidable than the same cat with flat fur, and in a genuine confrontation, looking bigger can be enough to end a conflict before it starts, without a single blow being thrown. A porcupine facing a predator relies on essentially this same reflex taken to its most extreme evolutionary conclusion. Both explanations make complete sense for a heavily furred ancestor. And that's exactly the problem, because at some point in human evolutionary history, we lost almost all of that fur, while somehow keeping the reflex fully intact and firing on schedule. This is a genuinely interesting case of what evolutionary biologists call a vestigial trait, a feature that no longer serves its original function but persists anyway because the underlying machinery producing it, the nerve pathways and muscles involved, wasn't actively harmful enough for natural selection to bother eliminating it. Your appendix is often cited as a similar example, a structure that likely served a clearer digestive purpose in a distant ancestor and stuck around afterward, mostly because removing it wasn't worth the evolutionary effort. Goosebumps appear to work the same way. The fur that made piloerection genuinely useful is mostly gone. The reflex that used to control that fur for reasons of evolutionary economy rather than ongoing usefulness stayed exactly where it was. That explains the cold-related goosebumps well enough. It's a leftover thermoregulation reflex, still faithfully trying to fluff up a coat that isn't there anymore. But it doesn't explain the other trigger, the one that has nothing to do with temperature at all. Why does an emotionally powerful piece of music, or a moment of genuine awe, or an unexpectedly moving scene in a film trigger the exact same physical reflex? This is where the story shifts from basic thermoregulation into something considerably stranger, and more recent research has focused specifically on this emotional variant, often called frisson, from the French word for a shiver or thrill. A researcher named Valorie Salimpoor, working with colleagues studying the neuroscience of music, used brain imaging to track what happens in the brain during moments of intense musical chills, the kind that produce visible goosebumps in a genuinely moved listener. The findings showed a measurable spike in dopamine release in the brain's reward circuitry, occurring specifically at the anticipated emotional peak of a piece of music, the build before a chorus, the resolution of a held chord, the moment a song's tension finally breaks. This wasn't a vague, generalized pleasure response. It was a precisely timed neurochemical event, tightly synchronized with a specific, anticipated musical moment. That's a strange thing to find sitting on top of an old fur-fluffing reflex. Somehow, over the course of human evolution, the ancient piloerection pathway, originally wired purely to sympathetic nervous system arousal from cold or threat, appears to have gotten cross-wired with something entirely different. Intense reward, intense emotional significance, intense psychological arousal of almost any powerful kind, not just fear or cold, apparently can flip the same old switch. A separate line of research adds a genuinely interesting personality dimension to this. A study led by researchers Mitchell Colver and Amani El-Alayli looks specifically at why some people reliably get chills from music, art, or emotionally powerful moments, while other people almost never do. Their findings pointed toward a personality trait sometimes described as openness to experience, one of the major dimensions psychologists use to describe personality differences. People who scored higher on this trait, characterized by a stronger tendency toward deep emotional and intellectual engagement with art, ideas, and aesthetic experience, were significantly more likely to report frequent chills or goosebumps in response to music specifically. The reflex itself is universal, wired into essentially everyone's nervous system. But the threshold for triggering it, through pure emotion rather than cold, appears to vary meaningfully based on how deeply an individual tends to engage with aesthetic and emotional experience in the first place. Put together, a genuinely strange picture emerges. You're carrying around a reflex built by evolution for a coat of fur you no longer have, a reflex that should, by pure logic, have become entirely useless and eventually faded away. Instead, it got repurposed. The ancient wiring for physical threat and cold apparently proved flexible enough that somewhere along the way, it also became available for something evolution almost certainly never originally selected for, marking, physically and involuntarily, the exact moments when something matters to you. A goosebump during a powerful piece of music isn't really about temperature or threat at all anymore. It's your oldest physical alarm system, borrowed and repointed at your own capacity for being moved. There's something worth sitting with in that. The same reflex a frightened porcupine uses to look larger to a predator is, in you, quietly marking the exact instant a song's chorus lands just right, or a story's final line lands harder than you expected. Evolution didn't plan for that crossover, it just left the wiring in place long enough for something unplanned to find a use for it. So the next time a wave of goosebumps rises across your arms during a song, or a story, or a moment that genuinely catches you off guard, know that you're feeling something genuinely old and genuinely repurposed. A reflex built for a coat of fur you no longer have, quietly doing an entirely different job now, marking, in real time, the exact moments your own nervous system has decided are worth paying attention to.